The airport buzzed with its usual blend of early morning chaos, announcements echoing over crackling speakers, hurried footsteps clacking against polished floors, and tired travelers clutching coffee cups like lifelines. But none of it fazed Ruth Wallace, a 68-year-old black woman in a navy trench coat, who moved with the calm grace of someone used to being overlooked. Her rolling suitcase glided quietly beside her as she navigated toward security, her mind focused only on the smile she hoped to see when her grandchildren opened the door at the end of her flight, unaware that this ordinary morning would soon unravel into something darker, something she had spent her life preparing for but never expecting to face in this way. Not here, not now. As she approached the TSA checkpoint, she offered her ID and boarding pass with a warm, "Good morning," her voice soft but firm, her posture straight, her hands steady. Yet she noticed it immediately, the pause, the way the white officer's eyes narrowed, not in inspection, but in assumption, scanning her not as a traveler, but as a question. And before she could even blink, his body stiffened, his hand subtly reaching toward his radio as if preparing for a threat. No one else could see, his voice suddenly sharp. "Step aside, ma'am." And that's when Ruth knew. This wasn't about routine. It wasn't about security. It was about her, about how her presence disrupted the picture he had drawn in his head of who belonged here and who didn't. And as he motioned her toward the secondary screening area, grabbing her bag from the conveyor belt without permission, without explanation, and holding it like it contained danger rather than clean clothes and toiletries, Ruth felt the all-too-familiar heat rise in her chest, not of guilt, but of fury buried beneath decades of training. Stay calm, stay polite, don't escalate. And yet the humiliation crept in like a slow poison as others stared, as whispers began, as her body was pulled from the anonymity she had hoped to preserve into the center of something she hadn't asked for, hadn't provoked, but had been chosen for all the same. And in that moment, in that sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway, where dignity goes to die in silence, Ruth stood surrounded not by danger, but by the assumption of it, and something inside her began to harden. Not fear, not shame, but the knowledge that this day would not end quietly. Not this time. Ruth stood motionless as the officer gripped her bag tighter than necessary, his knuckles whitening as if restraining something inside himself he hadn't yet named aloud, his eyes not meeting hers, but darting across her frame with a trained suspicion that said everything his silence wouldn't. He turned sharply and barked at a nearby female officer. "We've got a situation. Secondary room now." And just like that, Ruth was ushered away from the crowded security checkpoint, away from any witnesses, who might recognize how quickly an innocent woman had been turned into a suspect, her suitcase rolling behind her like a dragged accusation, and the moment the door shut behind them, the fluorescent lights hummed louder, more clinical, more hostile, like they too were complicit in what was about to happen. Inside the small windowless room, Ruth was instructed to remove her shoes, then her coat, then to empty her pockets slowly, carefully, like a ritual meant to strip not just items but identity. And as she complied, composed, breath controlled, she couldn't stop the echo in her mind of every black mother she knew who had taught their daughters exactly how to survive these moments. Don't speak unless asked. Keep your hands visible. Never raise your voice. Never cry in front of them because tears will be seen as guilt. The female officer, white and cold-eyed, pulled on a fresh pair of gloves with a snap and muttered, "We'll need to do a thorough check," her tone implying that Ruth had brought this on herself, that she was lucky they hadn't already called for more. And Ruth, still dignified, still standing tall, though her body ached from the flight delay and early hour, lifted her chin and asked with quiet strength, "What exactly do you believe I've done?" A question that hung in the air unanswered, because truth was irrelevant in rooms like this, where suspicion replaced evidence and skin color replaced proof. They unzipped her bag roughly, dumping the contents onto the metal table with no care, her folded clothes tossed like laundry in a storm, her toothbrush falling to the floor, her underwear held up and inspected like contraband. And as the male officer leaned in, flipping through her planner and inspecting a half-read book as if paper could conceal intent, he murmured, "You seemed nervous back there." Those words again, always the excuse, always the justification, that imagined nervousness used like a weapon, as if calmness was a privilege only given to those who never had to think about being profiled in the first place. Ruth's heart beat steady, not fast, not erratic, but full of rage. Her silence now a shield because she knew this was not the time to speak, even though every part of her soul screamed to do so. "Traveling alone?" the woman officer asked, peering through Ruth like glass, and when Ruth nodded, she smiled faintly, not kindly, but with the smugness of someone who believed they had found a crack in a mask, something to hold over her, because alone meant defenseless in their world. They ran swabs along the seams of her bag, beneath her shoes, along the pages of her book as though her fingerprints were criminal by default, and still not a single word of apology or explanation passed their lips, only orders, only suspicion, only that subtle undercurrent of contempt that needed no voice to be understood. Ruth watched the clock behind them, calculating the minutes stolen from her, the ones she would never get back, and she thought of her daughter, brilliant, respected, working in government, and how if she knew what was happening now, the walls of this room might just crack from the weight of the wrongness, and still they searched, still they peeled layers from her dignity, piece by quiet piece, never asking why she was traveling or where she was going, only making sure she was reminded again and again that she didn't look like she belonged here, not in their security lane, not in their airport, not in their comfort zone. And Ruth, though silent, made a decision in that room that would echo louder than any scream. They had tried to humiliate her, but they had no idea who they had just touched. The door to the screening room creaked open again with a jolt, and a second male officer stepped inside, younger than the first, but with that same mechanical posture, that same rehearsed stiffness of someone trained not to question authority, but to execute it. His eyes flicked across Ruth's face, and then to her hands, still resting calmly on the edge of the cold metal table where her belongings lay in a disorderly pile. And he didn't say hello, didn't introduce himself, only muttered to the others. She flagged under behavioral indicators, and just like that, a new layer was added to the performance. A vague, shapeless accusation based not on action, but on presence, on posture, on the imagined disobedience that came from simply existing in a black woman's body with quiet self-possession. The older officer gave a knowing nod, as if this confirmed everything, as if Ruth's refusal to shrink or cry or defend herself was further evidence of some buried threat. And when they asked her again, "Where are you going? Who are you seeing? Why are you flying alone?" Their voices had shifted from official to invasive, from procedural to personal, like her answers would never be good enough, like the very fact that she hadn't already confessed to something meant she was hiding everything. And Ruth answered calmly, "I'm flying to DC to visit my grandchildren." But they barely heard her, because her words didn't match the story they had already written in their minds. She wasn't supposed to be composed. She wasn't supposed to be educated. She wasn't supposed to be anything but afraid. And that was the story they were trying to force her into, one of guilt, of shame, of smallness. The young officer began flipping through her wallet, inspecting her government-issued Medicare card, her emergency contact list, even a folded church program she'd kept from her sister's funeral, and when he found a note written in her daughter's handwriting. "Mum, call me when you land. I'll have the boys ready for hugs." He read it aloud mockingly, then looked up and asked, "Your daughter wrote this. What does she do?" And Ruth paused for the first time, her lips parting just slightly, because she knew the power of that answer. But she wasn't ready to give it to them. Not yet. Instead, she said evenly, "She works in federal service." And the officer raised an eyebrow as if amused, like he'd heard that line too many times from people trying to name-drop their way out of trouble. And then he leaned closer, his voice lowering just enough to make it feel like a threat. "Ma'am, we've had People lie before. You wouldn't be the first, but if you were hiding anything, even a minor detail, it'll be a much bigger issue later. And Ruth's spine stiffened, because now it wasn't just her belongings being searched. It was her integrity, her life, her right to move through the world without suspicion. And the older officer added with a smirk, "You know, usually people who travel alone at your age, well, they're either very nervous or very practiced." As if she were some kind of smuggler, as if age made her more suspect, not less. The female officer returned with the results of the swabs, negative of course, because there had never been anything there. But instead of ending the process, they shifted tactics, asking more questions about her, travel habits, what time she left home, whether she packed her own bag. Questions that had already been answered and asked again only to maintain dominance, to stretch out the discomfort, to force her to feel the weight of their control. Ruth looked down at her belongings, strewn like trash, her privacy laid bare. And yet not one of them had said the word sorry. Not one had acknowledged the pain they were inflicting, because in their eyes, she had already failed the first test. She was black, she was alone, and she had dared to look like she belonged. And as they stepped outside to verify her responses, leaving her alone in that cold room, Ruth reached into her phone's contact list and finally tapped the name she'd been saving for last. Amira Wallace, DHS, Federal Communications Office. And as the line rang, Ruth straightened her back and whispered to no one, "You don't know who you just touched." Let's take a short pause. If you're listening right now, we'd love to know. Where are you tuning in from? Have you ever gone through something like this? Or witnessed a moment that made you stop and think about injustice? Share your experience in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the rest of this powerful story. Now, we continue. Ruth held the phone steady in her hand as it rang, once, twice, 3 times, until a calm, clipped voice picked up on the other end. "Mom, are you okay?" And the moment she heard her daughter's voice, the air in that stark, oppressive room seemed to shift, if only slightly. She didn't cry. She didn't whisper. She spoke clearly. "Amira, I'm being detained at the airport. They won't say why. They pulled my bag and took me into a room. I haven't done anything. Please do something." And Amira's response was instant, steel beneath silk. "Stay where you are. Don't say another word. I'm calling TSA headquarters right now." The call ended, and Ruth set the phone down with deliberate calm, just as the door reopened and the officers returned. But this time their expressions were different. Not remorseful, not afraid, but wary, like animals sensing something they couldn't yet see. And the older officer glanced at the phone still lit on the table before saying, "So, you made your call. That doesn't change procedure." But even as he spoke, there was tension in his voice, a hesitation in his movements, as if some unspoken warning had entered the room with them. The female officer began repacking Ruth's belongings with sudden precision, folding items she had earlier tossed aside without care, her eyes darting occasionally toward the hallway behind them. And Ruth didn't move, didn't speak. She watched. She absorbed. She allowed their discomfort to thicken the silence. "You can go now," the younger officer finally muttered, avoiding her gaze. But when Ruth asked, "Will I receive documentation of what just happened to me?" there was a pause, a flicker of irritation, before he said, "This was routine. There's no report." And the words stung more than she expected. Not because she needed their paper, but because they were trying to erase what they had done, as if her humiliation could be wiped clean just because they chose not to acknowledge it. She gathered her things slowly, her body stiff, her dignity bruised but not broken, and as she stepped into the hallway, she felt the eyes again. TSA agents, airport employees, passengers lingering too long near the corridor's edge, and all of them, watched her as if trying to place what kind of danger she had represented. Her only weapon had been her silence, her patience, her age, her presence. And for that, they had treated her like a criminal. She moved toward the terminal now, not rushing, but deliberate. And just as she reached her gate, a man in a suit, black earpiece, federal ID badge swinging from his neck, stepped in front of her and said in a measured tone, "Ms. Wallace, I was just on the phone with your daughter. We deeply regret what's happened here. Please, if you'll come with me for a moment. Behind them, the same officers from before had frozen, recognizing the badge, recognizing the weight behind it. And Ruth turned slowly to face them, not to gloat, not to threaten, but to let them see her, fully, unashamed and unbowed, before following the agent without a word, her back straight, her silence now louder than any outburst could ever be. Ruth followed the agent down a quiet hallway that branched off from the main terminal. A polished corridor that few travelers ever saw, lined with frosted glass doors and hushed conversations. The man walked beside her, not in front of her like the others had, and that alone felt different, respectful. He introduced himself only briefly. Agent Bradley, Department of Homeland Security. Then he added more quietly, "Your daughter contacted me directly. She asked me to meet you personally." It wasn't until they entered a small office, neat and softly lit, that Ruth finally sat down, placing her worn leather purse gently on the table. For the first time that morning, no one reached for it, no one hovered, no one asked her to explain herself. Instead, Agent Bradley sat across from her with his hands clasped together, a quiet urgency behind his composed face. "Ms. Wallace, first, I want to sincerely apologize for how you were treated. I've seen the footage from the security checkpoint. I'm not here to excuse anything, just to listen, and to make sure this doesn't get buried." Ruth didn't answer right away. She looked out the window instead, watching the movement of the tarmac beyond the glass, planes lifting and landing against the pale morning sky. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, low, and unmistakably firm. "I have lived through many versions of this country. I have seen it at its worst and at its most hopeful. But no matter how much I've accomplished, no matter what I've endured, I continue to be reminded that my presence still feels like a disruption. And I didn't deserve what happened this morning." Agent Bradley nodded. "No, you didn't." Ruth leaned forward slightly. "And I want to make one thing clear. I'm not just speaking for myself. What happened to me happens to black women, to black travelers, to elderly people, to anyone who doesn't look right in the eyes of authority. It may not always be in an airport. Sometimes it's in schools, in hospitals, in banks. And each time, there's a subtle erosion of dignity. That erosion, it's not just personal, it's cultural." Her words filled the room like water into a vessel, slow, heavy, inescapable. Back in the terminal, a very different kind of tension had begun to spread. Word of the incident had made its way through airport staff and into the hands of local press. A bystander's video had already gone online, quietly gathering views. Ruth's bag being seized, her being pulled aside, her calm, steady presence against the assertive and dismissive treatment. The comments section was growing by the minute, with some praising her composure and others, predictably, defending routine checks. But the video spoke for itself. It didn't need commentary. It was quiet, sharp evidence of something far too common to be denied. As the story began to gain momentum, TSA officials scrambled to prepare statements. The officer involved in the initial interaction was questioned, and though he didn't deny his actions, he did offer something that startled his own superiors. "She looked nervous," he repeated, like a reflex. Her silence, that's usually a red flag. Silence, that was what they had feared. But what Ruth understood, and what they failed to see, was that her silence had never been fear. It was focus. It was restraint. It was strength cultivated over a lifetime of knowing when to speak, when to wait, and when to act. Agent Bradley eventually stood, offering Ruth a warm bottle of water and a formal printout of the report he'd written on her behalf. "Your daughter has requested a direct review through her office," he said. "I assure you, this is being taken seriously." Ruth accepted the paper but didn't look at it right away. She didn't need confirmation of what she already knew. "I don't need a show of concern," she told him. "I need institutional memory. I need someone to remember this after the headlines fade. I need policies that don't just protect people when they have power behind them, but also when they don't." As Ruth was escorted back toward the terminal, a few heads turned. This time not in suspicion, but in recognition. The bystander who had filmed the video stepped forward tentatively. a young woman no older than 30. "I saw what happened earlier," she said. "I'm so sorry. I sent the video to my sister. She's in law school. She said she wants to use it as a case example for racial bias." Ruth met her gaze. Then it already served a purpose. She finally boarded her plane, and as it lifted into the sky, she closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in resolve. What had begun as a quiet morning flight had turned into a battle for dignity. And though the hurt still lingered, so did the truth. And the truth, once exposed, could not be ignored. She wasn't just someone's mother, someone's passenger, someone's inconvenience in a security line. She was a mirror, held up to a system that still chose to see certain bodies as threats. But now that mirror had cracked the silence, and the reflection was being watched. Ruth had expected to feel the weight of the situation lift the moment she boarded her flight, but even as the plane ascended into the sky, a quiet pressure continued to press on her chest. The anger, the frustration, the humiliation. They all settled into her bones, becoming something almost familiar. Yet, as the city below shrank into a patchwork of grey and green, Ruth couldn't ignore the quiet shift that had begun. The small, seemingly insignificant acts of resistance had a ripple effect. She knew this moment, this particular clash, had already become more than just an isolated incident. The flight was uneventful, her seat by the window providing a momentary escape from the intensity of her thoughts. Her mind often drifted back to the look of the young officer's face when she'd mentioned her daughter's name. The change in his posture, the nervous glance exchanged between him and his colleagues. It was a rare, fleeting moment where she saw the truth of the matter. Privilege recognized another form of power when it was forced to. Ruth had spent years cultivating an understanding of the systems that worked against her, but in that moment, the realization was even clearer. It was one thing to be seen as a problem by those who profiled her, but quite another when they saw that she had someone they couldn't easily dismiss. She sat back in her seat, resting her head against the window, trying to collect her thoughts as the flight continued. Her daughter's voice still echoed in her mind. "Stay calm. Don't engage. I'm getting this fixed." But Ruth had always known there was more to it than just getting things fixed. The system wouldn't change with one phone call. The people who treated her like a threat needed more than a call from a government official. They needed to be confronted with their own biases, their own ignorance, and Ruth wasn't sure if she was ready for that kind of fight. But the more she thought about the situation, the more she realized how much of it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been overlooked, ignored, or judged unfairly because of their appearance, their race, their status. She was a part of something much bigger than herself. The plane touched down smoothly at her destination, the bustle of the airport greeting her as she walked through the terminal with a steady gait. This time, no one noticed her. No one gave her a second glance, but she knew it wouldn't be long before she'd have to relive the experience. The media had already picked up the story, and as she saw her name flash across a few screens in the terminal, she understood that it wasn't going to fade away quietly. That was the price of this kind of visibility. Once you took up space, there were eyes on you, whether you liked it or not. Ruth had spent years making sure her work was never about seeking attention, about staying in the background where she could make the most impact. But now, her story was unfolding before the world, and she would have to navigate it with the same grace and resilience she had always done. As she made her way to the baggage claim, her phone buzzed with a series of messages. Her daughter had left several texts, all filled with updates, all wrapped in concern, but Ruth didn't have the energy to read them right away. Instead, she sat down on a nearby bench, closed her eyes for a moment, and let the noise of the airport wash over her. She needed a moment of clarity before she could face what came next. Her thoughts were interrupted by a quiet voice, and she opened her eyes to see a woman standing in front of her, holding her phone out, displaying a news article about the incident. "Is this you?" the woman asked, her voice hesitant, but her eyes full of something Ruth couldn't immediately place. Ruth nodded slowly. "Yes, it is." The woman didn't look away. She looked at Ruth's face with an intensity that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. "I saw what happened. I saw the video. I wanted to say, I'm sorry." Her voice faltered slightly. "No one should have to go through something like that. You handled it with so much grace." "Ruth," surprised by the woman's openness, offered a small smile. "Thank you. But grace doesn't erase the problem. This isn't just about me. It's bigger than one incident. It's about how this system treats people who look like me, people who don't fit the mold." The woman nodded, clearly moved. She glanced around the terminal, making sure no one else was listening, and then leaned in a little closer. "I'm a lawyer," she whispered. "I've seen cases like this before. It's not just about what happened to you. It's about what happens to all of us who've been ignored, treated like we don't matter." Her voice shook, and Ruth could hear the frustration and pain in it. "I've been there too. I've been that person in the airport, watched like I was doing something wrong just by being there. And it eats at you. It really does." Ruth could feel the weight of the woman's words settle deep in her chest. She had been right. The fight wasn't just hers. It was everyone who had ever felt small, invisible, undeserving of dignity. It was the years of systemic racism that had allowed this type of treatment to go unchecked. But it was also the quiet moments of resistance. The conversations, like the one she was having now, that made all the difference. The woman's eyes brightened a little, like she was making a decision in real time. "I'm going to help you. I'm going to make sure this doesn't go away. We'll fight this. You don't have to do it alone." Ruth felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. "Thank you," Ruth said softly. "But this fight is about more than just getting attention. It's about changing the way people think, the way they see us. We need to make sure it's not just a headline, that it's a movement, a change that lasts." The woman nodded, her voice steady. "We'll make sure of that. Together." As they stood together in the crowded terminal, Ruth couldn't help but think that this might be the beginning of something bigger than her. A real shift. The momentum was building, and for the first time in years, she wasn't fighting alone. It was still too early to know how far this would go, but Ruth Wallace was done being silenced, done being pushed aside. This was only the beginning, and now the world would have to listen. The days after Ruth's confrontation in the airport passed in a blur. Her name was now widely recognized, not just in her community, but across the country. The video of her detention, though brief, had sparked outrage, igniting a conversation about racial profiling that could no longer be ignored. People began to reach out, some offering words of support, others sharing their own painful stories of similar experiences. The message was clear. Ruth's moment of injustice had unearthed something that many had buried for far too long. Ruth had always lived her life with the knowledge that the world around her wasn't built for people like her to thrive. She had fought in many ways throughout her life. Small victories, quiet acts of resistance, all aimed at creating a space for herself and others who were often overlooked. But the airport incident had changed something. It had shown her that this fight wasn't just hers. It was a collective battle, a battle for dignity, for equality, and for the simple right to be seen as human. The following week, Ruth sat down with a team of lawyers and activists who had reached out after the viral video began circulating. The meeting was held in a small, quiet office, where the scent of old books and faint coffee lingered in the air. Around the table sat a diverse group: lawyers, community leaders, social justice advocates, each with a different role to play, but united in their desire for change. Ruth felt a sense of responsibility in that room, a weight that settled on her shoulders like a mantle. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless other black men and women who had been subjected to the same type of treatment, the same humiliation, without a platform to make their voices heard. One of the lawyers, a woman named Clara, spoke first. "Ruth, I can't tell you how many times I've seen something like this happen. But for every story that gets attention, there are hundreds more that don't. We have an opportunity here, not just to hold these officers accountable, but to shine a light on how systemic racism operates in everyday spaces like airports, schools, and workplaces." Ruth nodded, her eyes fixed on the table. "I don't want this to be just another headline. I want this to mean something. We need to make sure that people understand that this isn't about one officer or one mistake. It's about a system that has been built to see people like me as less than, and we have to change that system." The room fell silent as Ruth's words settled over them. There was no easy fix, no quick resolution, but they all knew that Ruth was right. The real work was in confronting the systems that allowed this type of behavior to continue unchecked. It was about creating lasting change, not just calling out the actions of a few bad apples. Clara picked up a stack of papers in front of her and slid them toward Ruth. This is a formal complaint we've drafted to submit to the Department of Homeland Security and the TSA. We want to make sure that the officers involved in your detainment are held accountable. But we're also going to push for policy changes that address racial profiling, bias training, and transparency in the security process. This isn't just about getting an apology, it's about ensuring that this doesn't happen again. Ruth looked down at the papers, the weight of it all settling on her once again. It was one thing to experience the injustice, to feel the sting of humiliation. It was another to see the larger picture, to understand that her fight was part of something much bigger than herself. She wasn't just speaking out for the sake of her dignity. She was speaking for everyone who had been treated the way she had, for everyone who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. And the reality was that this wasn't just an issue for Black people. It was an issue for every person who had ever been marginalized, every person who had ever felt like they didn't fit into society's narrow definition of what was acceptable. "I'll sign it," Ruth said, her voice steady. "But we can't stop there. We need to make sure that people understand that this is about more than just an incident. We need to make sure that every Black traveler, every person of color, feels safe when they walk through these airports. We need to make sure they don't have to live in fear of being singled out just for existing." Clara nodded, a determined look in her eyes. "That's the plan. We're going to build a campaign around this. We'll gather support from other civil rights organizations, activists, and community leaders. We're going to make sure that this isn't just your fight, it's everyone's fight." As the meeting wrapped up, Ruth stood up, feeling the quiet strength of those around her. She had come here seeking justice for herself, but now she was leaving with something much more powerful, an understanding that change was possible, but only if they were willing to fight for it. The work ahead wouldn't be easy, but Ruth was no stranger to hard battles. She had been fighting for equality and justice her entire life. This was just the next step. The campaign kicked off within days, drawing widespread attention to Ruth's case and the systemic issues within airport security. News outlets ran feature stories, interviews, and opinion pieces, all calling for change. Social media erupted with posts and hashtags, with people from all over the world sharing their own stories of racial profiling, of being treated as less than simply because of their skin color. The conversation grew louder, and the pressure on the TSA and Homeland Security mounted. But the real victory came not from the press, not from the campaign, but from the countless people who came forward with their own stories, their own experiences of being unjustly detained, surveilled, or harassed. For Ruth, it wasn't just about the apology from the officers who had treated her unfairly. It was about the collective power of people coming together to demand change. It was about showing the world that the system could be changed, that their voices, whether heard or ignored, could make a difference. Months passed, and Ruth's name became synonymous with the fight for racial equality in the travel industry. She continued to speak out, not just about what had happened to her, but about the larger issue of systemic racism in every facet of life. Her fight wasn't over, but she had come to understand that it wasn't about one victory. It was about creating the space for future victories, for future generations. And as Ruth stood at the front of another rally, surrounded by people of all backgrounds, all speaking the same truth, she knew that the fight wasn't just hers anymore. It was the fight of everyone who had ever been overlooked, ignored, or judged unfairly. The change was coming, and it was coming because people like Ruth Wallace refused to be silenced. As Ruth's name continued to spread through the media, so did the pressure on the agencies involved. What started as a simple act of injustice, her detainment at the airport, had become a symbol, a rallying cry for those who had experienced similar humiliation. Ruth had become a reluctant figurehead, a reminder of how often people of color were treated with suspicion, not because of anything they had done, but simply because of how they looked. But despite the growing support and the swelling chorus of voices demanding justice, Ruth couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation. It was as if the world had chosen her as the voice of an entire movement. But the weight of that responsibility was crushing. She had spent her life advocating for equality, for fairness, but now that the spotlight was on her, it was harder to stay grounded. The calls and emails were relentless. The pressure from the press was constant, and the demands for interviews and appearances were never ending. Ruth knew she couldn't back down. The movement was bigger than her. The conversation about systemic racism had reached a tipping point, and the change that people had been fighting for was finally within reach. But as the days stretched into weeks, and the protests continued to grow, she began to feel the emotional toll of it all. She had witnessed firsthand the power of solidarity, the strength of people coming together for a cause. But she also saw the fractures that existed, the divide between those who truly understood the struggle and those who were simply looking for a headline. One morning, Ruth sat alone in her small apartment, staring out the window as the city bustled beneath her. She had just received another call from her daughter, Amira, who had been a constant source of support throughout the ordeal. "Mom," Amira had said, her voice full of concern, "are you taking care of yourself? I know this is all a lot, but don't forget to rest. You're not in this alone." Ruth sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know, baby. I'm trying. But it's hard to feel like I'm not just a face for the media. I didn't ask for this kind of attention. I didn't want to become a symbol for a movement I've been part of for decades." Amira's voice softened. "You didn't choose to be a symbol, Mum, but you are. And you've got so many people behind you, supporting you. Don't let the weight of this crush you. We're all in this together." Ruth set the phone down, the words from her daughter settling heavily in her heart. It was true. She had never asked for this, never wanted to be thrust into the spotlight. But the reality was that the fight for justice, for equality, was never easy. It was messy, complicated, and sometimes exhausting. But it was also necessary. As Ruth prepared for another day of meetings, phone calls, and interviews, she tried to remind herself why she was doing this. This wasn't about her. It was about the countless others who had suffered in silence, whose voices had been silenced by a system designed to keep them in place. It was about the young black men and women who faced discrimination every day, who were detained at airports, questioned in stores, and told they didn't belong in spaces that were meant for everyone. The growing support for Ruth and the movement was undeniable, but so was the resistance. Ruth had already faced pushback from some of the very people she had worked alongside in the past, those who saw the movement as a threat to their own power and privilege. But she knew this fight wasn't about making everyone comfortable. It was about making the uncomfortable truths impossible to ignore. And so, Ruth continued to push forward, speaking out when she could, participating in rallies, giving interviews, and showing up at the front lines of this fight. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But Ruth knew that her story, her voice, was part of something much bigger than herself. It wasn't just about one woman's fight. It was about a nation's reckoning, about holding institutions accountable, about creating a world where everyone could walk through life without the constant fear of being seen as a threat. The movement was gaining momentum, and Ruth's role in it had become clearer with each passing day. The struggle wasn't over, but the seeds of change had been planted, and Ruth Wallace, once an ordinary woman just trying to get home, had become a symbol of resistance, of resilience, and of the power of standing up when the world told you to sit down. Ruth hadn't realized the toll the last few weeks had taken on her until the evening came and went without her noticing the setting sun. The media coverage had continued to spiral. The stories about her detainment at the airport now featured in everything from local news broadcasts to international think pieces. People were starting to ask the tough questions about the systemic issues of racial profiling. But Ruth didn't feel the triumph of success. She felt the weight of it all, like an anchor sinking into her chest. She had been raised to believe that change wasn't something that happened overnight, that progress was hard-won and slow, that the path would be long and full of obstacles. Yet the unrelenting cycle of interviews, protests, social media outbursts, and endless demands for her to take a stand in yet another setting had left her tired, emotionally drained. She had spoken on panels, sat in front of cameras, written statements, met with policymakers, and each time she felt the weight of her words get lost in the shuffle of political theatre. Her phone rang again, another interview request, another email from a journalist. But this time, Ruth didn't feel like she had the strength to answer. She had done enough. She had told the world what had happened to her, had faced down the public's gaze, and yet somehow it didn't feel like enough. Because the public would forget. The media would move on to the next story. The real work, the work of dismantling the systems that allowed these injustices to happen, was still a distant dream, one Ruth couldn't reach from where she was standing. Ruth's granddaughter, Lisa, was the one who brought her back to reality. Lisa had been a constant source of joy and relief during the chaotic weeks that followed the airport incident. She would visit Ruth, sit with her in the evenings, and talk about her schoolwork, her friends, and the small, quiet victories that children found in their lives. Lisa was still young, still innocent to the complexities of the world, and Ruth cherished every moment she could spend with her, reminding herself that this fight wasn't just about her, it was about Lisa and every child like her who deserved a future, free from the same fear and discrimination Ruth had faced. One afternoon, Lisa arrived at Ruth's apartment, holding something in her hands. It was a small, colourful poster with bold letters written across the top. No justice, no peace. Lisa smiled shyly as she handed it to Ruth. I made this at school. We're having a march tomorrow, and I wanted you to know that I'm marching for you, Grandma. Ruth's heart clenched, and for a moment, she found herself speechless. Her granddaughter, who had watched her endure so much, now stood in solidarity with her. She was just a child, but her voice would matter in the long run, Ruth knew. This march, this message, wasn't just a protest. It was a declaration that the fight wasn't over, and it would never be over until change was achieved. I'm so proud of you, Ruth whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But promise me something, Lisa. Promise me that you'll keep marching. Not just for me, but for everyone who needs a voice. Lisa nodded earnestly. I will, Grandma. I'll march for everyone. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Ruth had taken a step back from the media circus, choosing to spend time with Lisa and the other members of her family who were quietly supportive, but largely staying out of the limelight. She knew the movement didn't need her in the spotlight every moment. What mattered now was the groundwork, the conversations happening behind closed doors, the activists and lawyers fighting tirelessly to create real change, the protests gaining momentum across the country. The march Lisa attended was symbolic, peaceful, and powerful. Ruth didn't attend it herself, knowing that her presence in the crowd might shift the focus too much onto her rather than the cause. Instead, she stayed at home, listening to the chants and songs in the distance as she sat by the window, her heart swelling with pride and sorrow. There was so much more to do, but she could feel it. The change was coming. Ruth's daughter, Amira, had been pushing her own connections in Washington to make sure the case didn't disappear into a forgotten corner. The media might eventually move on, but the momentum was still there, and Amira had spent countless hours meeting with lawmakers, pressuring them to take a hard look at the practices of the TSA and Homeland Security, pushing for greater oversight, better racial bias training, and comprehensive anti-discrimination policies. But despite the progress being made in some areas, Ruth was painfully aware of the resistance they were facing from those in power who viewed change as a threat to their own comfort and control. Her phone rang again, and this time, it was Amira. Mum, I've got good news. We've been making real progress. They've agreed to put forward a new proposal for TSA reform. It's not everything we want, but it's a start. They're finally acknowledging the issues we've been bringing up. Ruth leaned back, the weight of everything beginning to settle. It's not everything, but it's something, she said quietly. The battle wasn't over. Far from it, but there was hope now. There was movement, and for the first time in a long time, Ruth felt the smallest stirrings of optimism, even if it was hard to grasp fully. The changes wouldn't happen overnight. The system was vast and complex, entrenched with decades of history that couldn't be erased in a single stroke. But Ruth was beginning to see the cracks. She was beginning to see that the world wasn't as indifferent as it used to be, that there were more people than ever willing to fight for equality, for justice, for change. And in the quiet moments, when she thought back to that day at the airport, when she had been reduced to nothing more than a suspect in the eyes of the officers, Ruth understood that it was not just the fight for her dignity that mattered. It was the fight for everyone who had been ignored, marginalized, or silenced. She knew now, without a doubt, that the power of collective voices would eventually be enough to break the system down. The journey wasn't over, but the path ahead was clearer than it had ever been before. Ruth had always been told to be patient, to wait for change. But now she knew that waiting wasn't enough. Change had to be fought for, every day, in every corner of society. And though the weight of the struggle was heavy, Ruth Wallace stood resolute, her heart filled with the belief that one day the world would finally see the truth, and she would be there to witness it. The months following the march were filled with an unrelenting flurry of action. Ruth watched as the story of her detainment continued to echo across the country, as if the world itself had finally decided to listen to the cries that had long gone unheard. She found herself a part of something much larger than she could have imagined, though the attention was often overwhelming. The media came and went, but the movement that had been sparked by her personal experience was far from over. Ruth's role in it, though still crucial, was evolving. She wasn't just the face of this fight anymore. She was a catalyst, an embodiment of the millions of black men and women whose lives had been marked by racial profiling and systemic injustice. As Ruth continued to support the legal teams working on policy changes and to participate in conversations about the future, there was a part of her that had begun to feel like the world was slowly, painstakingly waking up. Each victory, small or large, was a sign of progress, but Ruth knew better than to be complacent. There was still a long road ahead, one filled with roadblocks and resistance. She had lived through too much to believe that real change came easily. One afternoon, she sat in a crowded room at a national conference on racial justice, listening to activists, lawyers, and politicians discuss the future of the movement. Ruth was one of the keynote speakers, but this time, she didn't feel the pressure of speaking for herself. She was there to give voice to the experiences that so many had been forced to silence. She was there to push forward, to continue making the invisible visible. After the speech, a young woman approached Ruth, her eyes full of admiration. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice shaking. "I've never heard someone speak so openly about what it's like to walk in the world as a black woman, especially in spaces where you're made to feel like you don't belong. It's given me the courage to speak up, to share my own story." Ruth nodded, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. She had never considered herself a hero, never wanted to be. She was just a woman who had lived through things that had shaped her, things that had made her stronger, and it was only through sharing those experiences that she had come to realize that the change she sought wasn't something that would just be handed to her. She had to fight for it, and so did everyone else who had ever been overlooked. "I'm glad it helped," Ruth replied softly. "We all have a story to tell, and when we start telling those stories, we start seeing the world differently. Together, we can change the way things have always been." After the conference, Ruth returned to her apartment, tired but filled with a quiet satisfaction. Her phone buzzed again with messages, more updates, more calls for meetings, more interviews. But this time, Ruth didn't immediately jump to answer. Instead, she sat by her window, watching the streets below, thinking about the long journey ahead. The movement had gained traction, yes. The policies were beginning to shift, but it was going to take more than just policies. It was going to take years of education, of conversations, of dismantling systems that had been built on oppression. But Ruth believed in the power of that work. She had seen it in the way people were starting to organize, to speak out, to demand accountability. She had seen it in the eyes of the young people who had started to step into leadership roles, who were determined to finish what the previous generations had started. Her thoughts drifted to Lisa, her granddaughter, and what kind of world she would inherit. Lisa had already shown Ruth what it meant to be brave, to stand up for what was right, and Ruth knew that the future was in good hands. The next generation would carry the torch, but it was up to those of Ruth's generation to light the fire, to keep pushing until the world was different. It wasn't enough to be heard. The change had to come in every corner of society, in the way people saw each other, in the way they treated each other. And so, Ruth stood at the forefront of the movement, not as a hero, but as an advocate, as a fighter, as a witness to history. Her work wasn't over, but the ground had already shifted beneath her feet, and for the first time, she felt a sense of certainty in her heart. This wasn't just the beginning of her fight, this was the beginning of a new era. With every conversation, every march, every story shared, the world was changing. Ruth Wallace had become part of something larger than herself. She had helped create the momentum for change, and now she watched as it spread, far and wide, across the country, across generations. The struggle wasn't over, but Ruth knew that every step forward, no matter how small, brought them closer to a world that was just and equal for everyone. And as the sun began to set that evening, casting a warm golden glow across the city, Ruth allowed herself a moment of peace. She had fought for a lifetime, and while the work was far from finished, she knew one thing for certain: the world was listening, and it would never be the same again. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What did you think about Ruth's journey? Have you ever experienced or witnessed racism in your own life? Your insights are incredibly important to us, and we truly value each and every one of you who shares their thoughts and experiences. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with future stories. We appreciate all of you, and your support means the world to us. We wish you a wonderful day ahead, and if you've listened to the entire story, please leave a comment with a phrase or thought that stood out to you. This helps us know you're with us until the very end.